1890, a tourist was riding a horse across the desert, south of the Great Pyramid. It was an ordinary afternoon on an ordinary stretch of sand, the kind of ride that happens 100 times a day at Giza. Past the tour buses and the souvenir stalls, and out toward the emptier ground where the desert takes over again. Nothing about the place suggested anything. It was flat, unremarkable, covered in the same wind-blown sand that covers everything out there. And people had been walking and riding across it for as long as anyone could remember. Then the horse stumbled. Its hoof had caught on something just under the surface. Not a stone, a wall. The top course of a mud brick wall, buried and forgotten, that nobody had known was there. What lay underneath it would end an argument that had lasted 2,500 years. The wall that horse tripped over turned out to be the edge of a cemetery, and the people buried in it had been laid to rest within sight of the pyramid they had built, their bodies arranged carefully, bread and beer set beside them for the journey ahead, and above many of them, carved into stone, their names and the work they had done, so that anyone who came after would know exactly who was lying there. No slave in Egypt was ever buried like that. Before we begin, if you're listening to rest, to unwind, or to slowly drift off to sleep, you don't need to do anything at all. Simply close your eyes, get comfortable, and let this story carry you gently through the night. If peaceful history like this brings you a little calm, a quiet like helps this channel more than you'd think. Now, let's begin. Let's begin with the story everyone was told, and how it came to be believed for so long. The idea that slaves built the pyramids does not come from Egypt. That is worth saying slowly, because it is the part that surprises people most. It does not appear in any Egyptian text. It is not written on any tomb wall, not recorded in any administrative document, not mentioned in any of the tens of thousands of inscriptions that survive from a civilization that wrote down almost everything it did. Egypt kept records obsessively. It counted cattle and grain and jars of oil and days of labor. And in all of it, there was no account of enslaved masses building the pyramids. The story comes, more than from anywhere else, from a single Greek traveler. His name was Herodotus, and he arrived in Egypt around 450 years before the Common Era. He is often called the father of history, and he deserves the title because he was genuinely trying to do something new. He traveled, he asked questions, he wrote down what people told him about their own countries, and he did it with a curiosity and a warmth that still comes through the page after 2,500 years. He was also, it has to be said, an enthusiastic collector of stories, and not always a careful one. But the detail that matters most about Herodotus in Egypt is not his method, it is the arithmetic. By the time he stood in front of the Great Pyramid and asked who had built it, the pyramid was already more than 2,000 years old. Sit with that for a moment, because it is easy to hear and hard to actually feel. The distance in time between Herodotus and the men who cut those stones is roughly the same as the distance between Herodotus and us. He was not a witness to anything. He was a foreign visitor, standing in front of something impossibly ancient, asking local guides to explain it, and writing down whatever they said. And the guides gave him a story. They told him that Khufu had been a tyrant, that he had closed the temples across Egypt and forbidden his people their sacrifices, that he had forced the entire population into labor on his tomb, working them in shifts of 100,000 men at a time, 3 months on, and then relieved by the next 100,000, for 20 years without pause. That the causeway alone had taken a decade to build. That the people had come to hate his name so thoroughly that in Herodotus's own day, centuries later, Egyptians still would not say it aloud and referred to the pyramids by the name of a shepherd instead. He also repeated a story about the king's own daughter and what Khufu supposedly made her do to raise money for the project that is so lurid and so obviously improbable that most modern historians treat that entire passage as exactly what it sounds like: gossip, a tall tale told to a visitor who was clearly enjoying himself, written down by a man who could not resist a good story. 2,000 years of local legend filtered through a foreign tourist, recorded as history. And it stuck. It stuck for a very long time, because for most of that time, there was nothing to weigh against it. The hieroglyphs could not be read. The site had not been excavated. Anyone in Europe who wanted to know how the pyramids were built had exactly one source, and that source said tyranny and forced labor. And so, tyranny and forced labor is what everyone believed. It was helped along much later by an association that does not survive close reading either. Somewhere in the popular imagination, the pyramids became attached to the story of the Israelites in Egypt, and the image of an enslaved people building monuments for a pharaoh fixed itself in the culture in a way that no amount of correction has ever quite dislodged. It is worth saying plainly, and without any argument about the text itself, that the biblical account does not describe anyone building pyramids. It describes making mud brick and building store cities in the Delta. And the period it describes is set many centuries after the Great Pyramid was already ancient. The two things are separated by more time than separates us from the fall of Rome. Then came the 20th century, and the cinema, which finished the job. Enormous sets built in the desert, thousands of extras, ranks of men straining at ropes under a white sun, while a figure with a whip walks slowly down the line. It is one of the most durable images Hollywood ever produced, and for most people alive today, it does not feel like a theory about the past at all. It simply is the past. It is what appears automatically, unbidden, in the back of your mind the moment somebody says the word pyramid. None of it came from evidence. It came from a Greek tourist, a misremembered scripture, and a film studio. Meanwhile, about a kilometer south of the Sphinx, under a stretch of sand that people had been walking over for 100 years, the actual evidence was lying quietly in the ground, exactly where the people who left it had put it. It had been there the entire time. Nobody had thought to dig. If you're still with me and you'd like more quiet history like this, subscribing helps these stories find the people who need them. Now, let's go back further to the country that made all of this possible in the first place. To understand who these people were, you first have to understand the country that sent them. By the time the first block of the Great Pyramid was set in place, Egypt was already old. Not old the way we tend to think of ancient things, as a vague and undifferentiated past, but old to itself. The two lands of the north and the south had been unified for something like 500 years already. There had been kings before Khufu, going back through generations that the Egyptians themselves could only half remember, whose names survived on lists and fragments, and whose tombs were already being visited as antiquities. There was writing, there was taxation, there were provincial governors and a civil service, and a system of record-keeping so thorough that 4,500 years later, we can still read what a work gang ate for lunch. All of this at a time when most of the rest of the world was still working out how to keep a village fed through the winter. That matters more than any engineering question, because you cannot build a pyramid without a bureaucracy. The stone is the easy part. The hard part is knowing how many men are coming next month, and how much bread they will need, and which quarry the limestone is coming from, and whether the boat that carries it is repaired, and who is responsible if it isn't. Egypt could do that. Almost nobody else on Earth could. Khufu was the second king of what we now call the Fourth Dynasty. And what he inherited from his father was not an idea. It was a solved problem. His father's name was Sneferu, and Sneferu remains, by a considerable margin, the most prolific pyramid builder in Egyptian history. He built 3 of them. Taken together, they contain more stone than the Great Pyramid does. And the reason he built 3 is the most quietly human detail in the whole story of Egyptian architecture. The first 2 did not work. The first stands at Maidum. It was raised as a stepped structure, tier upon tier in the older tradition, and then packed out with an outer skin to give it smooth sides. At some point, either during construction or in the long centuries afterward, that outer skin came away. What stands there today does not look like a pyramid at all. It looks like a squat tower rising out of a great sloping hill of its own broken rubble. And standing at the base of it, you are looking at what is either an unfinished project or a slow collapse, and Egyptologists still argue about which. The second stands at Dashur, and it is the one that people photograph and assume is a distortion of the lens. It begins from the ground at a steep angle, confident and severe. And then roughly halfway up, the angle abruptly changes. The sides flatten out and carry on to the summit at a much gentler slope. So the whole structure looks as though it changed its mind partway through. It is called the bent pyramid, and the most widely accepted explanation is exactly what your eye tells you when you look at it. Somebody realized while it was going up that the structure was in trouble, that the angle was too steep and the mass was too great, and something inside was beginning to move. And rather than lose the entire thing, they made a decision to shed weight and finish it lower. You can still see inside that pyramid the timber bracing they put in to hold the chambers steady. Cedar beams, 4,500 years old, wedged into place by men who were worried. The third one worked. The Red Pyramid, also at Dashur, built at the shallower angle they had learned the hard way to trust, is the first true smooth-sided pyramid ever completed. It still stands, essentially intact, and you can walk into it today. So when Khufu came to the throne, he was not standing at the beginning of anything. He inherited masons who had already made every mistake it was possible to make. He inherited an administration that had moved millions of tons of stone by river 3 times over. He inherited engineers who knew from direct and expensive experience exactly what angle a pyramid could hold and what happened if you got greedy. The Great Pyramid was not a leap into the unknown. It was the next step in a process that had been running since before he was born, taken by people who had watched the previous attempts fail and had spent their careers working out why. And about the man himself, we know almost nothing. He ruled somewhere in the region of 23 years, although even that figure is disputed. His mother was called Hetepheres, and her burial equipment was found at Giza, hidden in a shaft, in circumstances that have never been satisfactorily explained. He had several wives and a great many children, some of whom ruled after him. Beyond that, the record is thin in a way that begins to feel almost deliberate. And there is one detail that stops people every time they hear it. The only certain surviving image of Khufu is an ivory figurine 3 inches tall. It was not found at Giza. It was found at Abydos, hundreds of kilometers to the south, broken, its head separated from its body. The head only came to light at all because the excavator, unsatisfied, went back and had the debris sifted a second time. Had he not bothered, we would have no face for him whatsoever. The man who built the largest stone structure ever raised by human hands is known to us today from a statuette you could close inside your fist. There is something worth resting on there, in the quiet. He spent 20 years and the organized labor of an entire nation, making certain that he would not be forgotten. And what survived is the pyramid, standing on the plateau, visible from orbit, the last of the seven wonders still upright, and a thumb-sized figure in a museum case that we very nearly lost in a pile of dirt. Everything about ancient Egypt begins with the river, and almost everything about the pyramids does too. The Nile runs south to north, from the highlands of Africa down through the desert to the delta and the sea. The prevailing wind across Egypt blows the other way, from the north, pushing inland against the current. That combination is one of the great accidents of geography, and it is difficult to overstate what it gave them. A boat loaded with stone could drift north with the current, carrying weight it could never have carried over land. And once emptied, it could raise a sail and let the wind push it back south again. Egypt had a highway running the entire length of the country, in both directions, requiring almost no energy to use. Every quarry that mattered sat within reach of it. Every town, every temple, every building site that ever needed heavy material had a river running past it. The granite for the burial chamber came from Aswan, more than 800 kilometers upstream, and it came by water. The fine white limestone for the outer casing came from Tura on the opposite bank, and it came by water. Take the river away, and the pyramids are not merely harder, they are impossible. And then, every year, that same river did something else. The flood came in midsummer, swollen by monsoon rains falling on the Ethiopian highlands, a continent away. And the Nile rose out of its banks and spread across the valley floor. For weeks, the fields disappeared underwater. When it drew back, it left behind a layer of black silt so rich that Egyptian farmland regenerated itself annually without anyone having to do anything at all. The Egyptians called their country Kemet, the Black Land, named for that mud. But look at what the flood meant for the people who lived there. For a substantial part of every single year, the fields were underwater, and the entire agricultural population of Egypt, which was to say almost everybody, had nothing whatsoever to do. They could not plow, they could not sow, they could not harvest. They sat in villages up and down the valley, waiting for the water to go down. Now put that beside a state that needed enormous numbers of hands for a project of its own. That is the fit. That is the piece that makes the entire system fall into place. The pyramid was not built in defiance of the agricultural year. It was built inside the gap the agricultural year left open, using people who were, for those months, genuinely available and who still needed feeding, whether they worked or not. Which brings us to the strangest thing about the Egyptian economy, at least to modern ears. There was no money, no coins, no currency of any kind. Coinage would not arrive in Egypt for another 2,000 years, and when it did, it came from outside. The economy of the Old Kingdom ran on grain, on cattle, on cloth, on oil, on beer. All of it grown, or made or brewed, then counted, recorded, stored in state granaries, and redistributed by an administration that tracked it in obsessive detail. Taxes were paid in produce and in labor. That labor obligation had a name, and versions of it persisted in Egypt in one form or another for thousands of years afterward. It was a duty owed to the state, discharged in work rather than goods, and it applied broadly across the population. If the state called and you were fit, you went. It is important to be honest about what that means and does not mean. It does not mean these people were free in any sense we would recognize today. Refusing was not a realistic option. There was no negotiation, no wage bargaining, no walking away to find better terms somewhere else. This was a rigid, deeply unequal society in which the great majority of people were born into agricultural labor and stayed there, and in which the king was understood to be a living god whose requirements were not open to debate. But there is an enormous distance between a demanding obligation and chattel slavery, and the distance shows up in the details. These workers were fed by the state, and fed well. They were housed, they were treated when they were injured, they were organized into named teams. They went home when their term ended, and when they died, some of them were buried within sight of the thing they had built, with their names carved above them. None of those things describe property. They describe employment in a world that had not invented wages. And there is one more piece, which is the hardest for a modern audience to take seriously, and which the people involved would have considered the most important of all. They believed it mattered. The pyramid was not, in their understanding, one man's vanity project. The king was the hinge between the human world and the divine one, and his safe passage into the next life was not a private matter. It held the order of the cosmos in place. It kept the sun rising and the flood arriving and the country functioning. Building his tomb was not something being done to them. It was something they were part of, the most significant thing most of them would ever be part of. We can be skeptical of that belief. They were not. So here is what they were asked to build. Numbers are difficult in the dark, and I want to be careful with them because a documentary can throw figures at you until they stop meaning anything. So let's take them slowly, one at a time, and let each one settle before the next. The Great Pyramid contains somewhere in the region of 2.3 million blocks of stone. It stood originally at about 146 meters. It lost some height over the millennia as the outer casing was stripped away. But for nearly 4,000 years, until a cathedral spire went up in England in the 14th century, it was the tallest structure human beings had ever made. 4,000 years is a long time to hold a record. It is longer than the record has been broken. The base covers something in the region of 13 acres. The four sides at the bottom are very nearly the same length as each other, differing by a matter of centimeters over more than 230 meters. The whole structure is aligned to true north with an accuracy that is genuinely difficult to explain, and which they achieved with no compass, no instruments as we would understand them, almost certainly by watching stars circle the pole through the night and splitting the difference. The average block weighs somewhere around 2.5 tons, but the granite beams roofing the burial chamber are a different matter entirely. Those weigh between 50 and 80 tons each. They came from Aswan, more than 800 kilometers to the south, and they had to be lifted roughly 70 meters into the air and set precisely into place inside a structure that was still being built around them. And they had roughly 20 years. If you take those two figures and simply divide one by the other, you arrive at a number that most people assume must be wrong. Working every day through the whole of that period, it comes out at something like 1 block placed every 2 or 3 minutes. That is the real problem of the Great Pyramid. Not how they cut the stone, not how they dragged it, how they kept a delivery arriving every 2 minutes for 20 years without the whole thing seizing up. That is a logistics problem. It is the same problem a modern port has, or a railway network. And it is why the town under the sand matters so much, because a rhythm like that cannot be sustained by suffering. It can only be sustained by organization. As for the work itself, most of it is less mysterious than people expect. The bulk of the stone did not travel far at all. It was quarried a few hundred meters from where it was laid, on the plateau itself, and you can still see the quarry scars in the bedrock south of the pyramid. The soft limestone was cut with copper tools, wooden wedges, and enormous patience, then levered out in blocks and moved on sledges over prepared trackways. There is a wall painting from a much later tomb that shows a colossal statue being dragged on a sledge by rows of men. And standing on the front of that sledge is a single figure pouring liquid onto the sand directly in front of the runners. For a long time, that figure was read as ceremonial. Modern experiments have shown he was doing something entirely practical. Damp sand, at the right moisture, does not pile up ahead of a sledge the way dry sand does. It roughly halves the force needed to pull the load. They had worked that out, and they had it painted on a wall, and we spent centuries assuming it was a ritual. The heavy granite came by river from Aswan, floated down on barges during the flood season when the water was high enough to bring boats close to the plateau. They cut canals and built harbors to shorten the last part of the journey. How the stone got up is the part still genuinely argued about. Some form of ramp is the consensus, but every version has a problem. A single straight ramp to the summit would need to be so enormous that building it becomes a bigger project than the pyramid. Ramps spiraling around the outside make it very hard to check that your corners are still true. There are proposals involving internal ramps external ramps that were dismantled as the structure rose, counterweight systems using the internal galleries, and combinations of all of them. The honest answer is that we do not know. There is no surviving Egyptian document that explains it, and the ramps, whatever they were taken away when the job was done. That is a real gap in the record, and it is worth saying plainly rather than papering over. But notice that the gap is narrow. We know where the stone came from. We know what tools cut it. We know how it was moved across flat ground and by water. We know how the site was surveyed and aligned. We know who was working there, what they ate, where they slept, and what happened when they were hurt. The unknown is one step in a long chain. And the presence of one unanswered question does not make the other 90 answered ones disappear. That distinction matters because the gap is where the strange theories live, and the men and women in that town under the sand deserve better than to have their work handed to somebody else simply because we cannot yet draw their scaffolding. The wall that Horst tripped over in 1990 led to a cemetery. And the cemetery led immediately to a question that should have been obvious for a century, and somehow was not. If these people were buried here, where did they live? Because a burial ground implies a community. Graves do not appear in empty desert. Somewhere nearby, there had to be houses and kitchens and workshops and all the ordinary apparatus of thousands of people living and eating and sleeping through years of work. Nobody had ever found it. To a surprising extent, nobody had ever seriously looked because everyone already believed they knew the answer. Slaves do not have towns. It turned up a few hundred meters further south, under a low stretch of desert that had been walked across, driven over, and comprehensively ignored. The site is known now as Heit el-Ghurab, the Wall of the Crow, named after an enormous stone wall that runs across the plateau there, and which had been standing in plain sight the entire time. Archaeologists have been excavating it since the late 80s. They are still not finished. What has emerged from the ground is one of the most detailed pictures of ordinary working life anywhere in the ancient world. It is not a camp. That distinction matters. A camp is what you would expect from forced labor. Temporary shelters, thrown up wherever there was room, abandoned when the work moved on. This was a planned settlement. Streets running in straight lines, buildings arranged in blocks, drainage, long galleries designed to sleep large numbers of people in an orderly way, built to a repeating template, laid out by somebody who knew in advance how many were coming and what they would need when they arrived. Somebody sat down before any of this existed and designed a town. Start with the bakeries, because they were among the first things found, and they set the tone for everything after. The excavators uncovered rooms filled with heavy, conical clay molds, stacked in rows, blackened from use. These were the vessels a particular kind of dense, dark bread was baked in, and the scale of what was going on in those rooms is genuinely hard to take in. This is not a household making bread for a family. This is production. Rows of molds heated in ash-filled pits, working through the day, every day, feeding thousands of people who had no time and no facilities to cook for themselves. Beside the bakeries, they found the vats. Large ones set into the floor, with residue still adhering to the walls after 4,500 years. Breweries. Beer in ancient Egypt was not what beer is to us. It was thick, cloudy, only lightly alcoholic, closer to a liquid porridge than a drink. It was a staple food rather than a pleasure. It carried calories and nutrients, and in a country where drinking the water could quite easily kill you, the brewing process made it safe. Bread and beer were the twin foundations of the Egyptian diet, and they were what these people were paid in. The town was built to produce both continuously at industrial scale. Then they found the fish, enormous quantities of it, the remains of a fishing operation supplying the site from the Nile and the Delta, and with it, cattle bones, sheep, goats. The deposits are dense enough that estimates have been made from them, and the estimates are what stopped several archaeologists in their tracks. The numbers suggest something in the region of 12 cattle and dozens of sheep and goats arriving at this site every single day. You have to understand what beef meant in Old Kingdom Egypt to feel the weight of that. Cattle were wealth. They were the standard by which a rich man's holdings were counted. Ordinary Egyptians ate meat rarely, at festivals, if at all. Most people lived on bread, beer, onions, fish, and whatever they could grow. A workforce eating beef regularly, delivered daily, is a workforce that the state considered worth keeping strong. Nobody spends that kind of wealth on people they regard as disposable. You do not ship prime cattle across a country every day to feed men you intend to work to death. The economics do not make sense. If these people were expendable, the correct thing to do, coldly and cynically, is feed them the cheapest possible calories and replace them when they fail. Instead, somebody was sending them the good food. Then there is the building that changed the tone of the entire site. Among the structures the excavators uncovered was one that appears to have functioned as something close to a medical facility, a place where injured people were brought and looked after. But the building itself is not really the evidence. Buildings are ambiguous. Rooms can be interpreted several ways, and archaeologists argue about function all the time. The evidence is in the bones, because the skeletons recovered from the cemeteries on that slope carry the medical history of the people who worked here, written directly into them, in a form that cannot be reinterpreted or explained away. Bone remembers. It records what happened to a body, and crucially, it records what happened afterward. And what these bones record is care. There are broken arms and broken legs, which is precisely what you would expect at a site where multi-ton stones were being moved by hand every few minutes for 20 years. Limbs get crushed, people fall, sledges slip. But the fractures are set. They were splinted. The bone ends were aligned and held in position and given time. And many of them healed cleanly enough that whoever was treating them clearly knew what they were doing and had done it many times before. There are arms that healed straight. There are legs that took a person's weight again afterward. There is evidence of head injuries that were treated and survived. There are cases of amputation where the patient went on living for years afterward. In a world with no antibiotics and no understanding of infection as we know it, surviving an amputation for years is an extraordinary outcome. It means the wound was cleaned, dressed, and cared for by somebody who was paying attention. There is a documented case of a man whose leg was amputated and who lived on, and whose burial was as careful as anyone else's. And there are spines, a great many spines, showing the compression and the wear that comes from a lifetime of carrying heavy loads, vertebrae flattened, joints worn through, backs that took punishment year after year in bodies that kept working and kept being fed and lived on into what counted then as middle age. Now, think carefully about the sequence of decisions that every one of these healed bones represents. Somebody had to notice the injury. Somebody had to take that person off the work, not for an hour, for weeks, possibly for months. Somebody had to set the bone properly, which requires skill that only comes from training and repetition. Somebody had to keep feeding that person while they produced absolutely nothing. In an economy with no money, where wages were literally bread and beer out of a state granary, that food is a real and measurable cost, paid daily for a person contributing nothing at all. Somebody had to house them and treat them again if it went wrong. And then, when they had healed, somebody had to let them come back. Every single one of those steps cost time, food, and organization. Every one of them is a deliberate decision to keep a human being rather than discard them and bring in another. That is not how any society in history has treated bodies it considered expendable. We know what that looks like in the archaeological record because we have found it in other places and other centuries. It looks like untreated fractures that healed crooked because nobody stopped the work. It looks like malnutrition in the bones. It looks like young adults dying and being disposed of without ceremony, in pits, without grave goods, without names. Giza looks nothing like that. Giza looks like a workforce that somebody was actively trying to keep alive. The bones show something else too, and it is worth saying because it keeps this honest. These people worked extremely hard, and their bodies paid for it. The wear is real. The arthritis is real. Many of them died younger than we would consider fair, and life expectancy across the board was short by any modern measure. There is no version of this story where pyramid building was pleasant. But there's an enormous difference between a hard job that damages your body over decades and a system designed to consume people. One of those leaves worn joints and healed fractures and graves with names on them. The other leaves something very different in the ground. And then there are the graves themselves, the cemeteries that started all of this when a horse put its foot in the wrong place. Because those graves say something even the bones do not. There are 2 cemeteries on that slope, and the relationship between them is the most quietly human thing on the entire site. The upper cemetery holds the supervisors. Their tombs are larger, more carefully built, some with small stone chapels where family could come and leave offerings. Some have inscriptions running across the walls and false doors through which the spirit was meant to pass. The lower cemetery, further down the hill, holds the ordinary workers. These are simpler, often a modest mud brick dome over a shallow shaft. Nothing grand. But they are graves, prepared, deliberate graves, and that is the part that ends the argument entirely. To understand why, you have to understand what burial actually meant to an Egyptian, because it was not sentiment and it was not decoration. It was the whole point. The Egyptian view of death was not that it ended you. It was that death was a passage, and that surviving that passage required specific things to be done correctly. The body had to be preserved and positioned. Offerings of food and drink had to be provided for the journey, and the name had to be recorded and spoken. Because a name that was remembered was a person who continued, and a name that was forgotten was a person who was truly gone. Egyptians erased the names of their enemies from monuments. They did it deliberately, with chisels, not as an insult, but as an execution carried out after death. To remove a name was to annihilate a soul. So when you find a grave at Giza, with a body laid out properly, with bread and beer set beside it for the journey, with a small amulet, or a favorite pot, or the tools of a trade placed within reach, and with a name carved above it in stone, you are not looking at a courtesy. You are looking at somebody being given eternity. That is not something you hand to property. It is not something you hand to a body you dragged out of a work camp. It is something a community does for its own. And the names are the thing that makes the whole site suddenly resolve into focus. They are not a list. They come with job titles, and the titles describe a structure: overseer of the side of the pyramid, director of workers, inspector of the craftsmen, overseer of masonry, chief of the drillers. Titles indicating rank, responsibility, and specialism. Titles that imply somebody above you and somebody below you, and the possibility of moving between them. Slaves do not hold professional ranks. Slaves are not given supervisory titles. Slaves are not described by the trade they mastered. Some of the tombs show a man alongside his wife, with her own name and sometimes her own title carved beside his. Families, people who lived at Giza with the people they loved and expected to be remembered together. And on one of them is the phrase that has become the site's unofficial signature: friend of Khufu, not property of, not servant of, friend. Then there is a detail that reads almost like a message left deliberately, though it was never meant to be found. Deep inside the Great Pyramid, in the cramped relieving chambers above the king's chamber, in spaces that were sealed when the structure was completed and were never intended to be entered again by anyone, there are markings painted on the stone in red ochre. They are work gang names. The crews who cut and hauled and set those blocks signed them, not on the outside where a supervisor might see, on the hidden faces, in the dark, in spaces that were about to be closed forever. The names they chose for themselves are the point. One gang, working on Khufu's pyramid, called itself the Friends of Khufu. Another, on a later pyramid at Giza, called itself the Drunkards of Menkaure. Sit with that for a moment. In the dark, nobody being driven under a whip names their crew the Drunkards of anything. That is a name invented by men who worked together, who had a reputation among the other gangs, and who thought it was funny. It is a football team name. It is a regiment nickname. It is the kind of thing you call yourselves when you are proud of your crew and slightly proud of your habits. They painted it on a stone in a chamber nobody was ever supposed to open, and then they sealed it up and went home. 4,500 years later, somebody crawled in there with a lamp and read it. So who were they, if not slaves? The picture that has assembled itself over 35 years of excavation is not one workforce. It is two, working alongside each other with very different lives. The first group was permanent. Some thousands of skilled workers lived at Giza year-round, and this was simply their profession. Masons who cut and dressed stone, stonecutters who worked the quarry face, carpenters who built and repaired the sledges and the scaffolding and the boats, metal workers who kept the copper tools sharp, which was a full-time job in itself, because copper is soft and every chisel needed constant reworking. Surveyors who kept the structure true. overseers who kept the whole thing moving. These were careers. Men trained into them spent their working lives at it, and in many cases, passed the trade to their sons, who grew up on that plateau and learned to cut stone the way a farmer's son learned to read the flood. For these families, Giza was not a posting. It was home. They were born there, married there, raised children there, and were buried in the cemetery on the slope. Around that permanent core rotated the second group, and this was much larger. Ordinary Egyptians from villages up and down the Nile, who came for a period of weeks or months and then went home again. Farmers, mostly. Men who were surplus to requirement during the flood, when their fields were underwater and their families were living on stored grain anyway. They came, they worked, they were fed, and they left. Then the next group arrived, and the way they were organized is one of the more revealing details in the whole record, because we know it in some detail from inscriptions across several sites. The workforce was divided into large units, which Egyptologists translate as gangs, numbering perhaps 2,000 men each. Each gang carried a name, usually incorporating the kings. The Friends of Khufu was one such name, painted in a sealed chamber by the men it belonged to. Each gang was divided into 5 smaller units. The Egyptian word for these translates roughly as watches, and the names they carried are unexpectedly charming because they are nautical. Starboard, port, green, little, good. The vocabulary of a ship's crew applied to men hauling limestone in a desert. It is a small thing, but it tells you the organizational template they were working from. Egypt was a river civilization. When Egyptians needed to organize a large group of men into shifts that could work in rotation and be held accountable, they reached instinctively for the way you organize a boat. And each of those watches was subdivided again into small teams of perhaps 20 men, each with its own designation. He knew who he worked with. He knew who was above him. He knew what his crew was called. That is not the structure of forced labor. It is the structure of an army, or a shipyard, or a modern construction firm. It exists because it works, and because it is the only way to move 2.3 million blocks without the entire operation collapsing into chaos. It also explains the graffiti. Men who belong to a named crew competing with other named crews will absolutely sign their work in a place nobody is meant to look. That is what crews do. It is what they have always done. There is one more thing about the rotation that is easy to miss. These men went home. At the end of their term, they walked back to their villages, and they took the story with them. A farmer from somewhere in Middle Egypt who had spent 3 months at Giza went home having seen the largest building project in the history of the world, having eaten beef, having worked in a team with a name, having been part of something that was going to outlast every single person he had ever met. Multiply that by 20 years, and by tens of thousands of men, and by the villages they returned to. The pyramid was not only a tomb, it was the single greatest shared experience of that entire generation of Egyptians, and they carried it back up and down the river with them. Which raises an obvious question, and one we can actually answer, because a few years ago, somebody found the paperwork. In 2013, a French and Egyptian team was excavating at a place called Wadi al-Jarf on the shore of the Red Sea, a considerable distance from Giza and from anywhere else that matters. They were working on a harbor, the oldest artificial harbor ever found anywhere in the world, built for expeditions crossing the water to the Sinai to bring back copper and turquoise. There are galleries cut into the rock nearby, where boats were dismantled and stored between voyages, sealed up with the ropes and timbers still inside. In front of one of those sealed galleries, among the debris, they found papyrus. Hundreds of fragments of it, and when they were pieced together and read, they turned out to be the oldest inscribed papyri ever discovered. Documents written down 4,500 years ago, in the 27th year of the reign of Khufu, which means they were written while the Great Pyramid was still being built. Not a later account, not a memory, not a Greek visitor 2,000 years afterward writing down what a guide told him. Paperwork, produced on site by someone doing the job. Among the fragments was a logbook kept by a man called Merer. Merer was an inspector. He commanded a team of around 40 men, and his job was hauling stone. Specifically, he ran a boat crew, moving fine white limestone from the quarries at Tura on the east bank of the Nile, downstream to Giza, where it would be dressed and set as the outer casing of the pyramid. And he kept records, day by day. The document reads, in its structure, exactly like a modern timesheet. It is laid out in columns. Each day gets a line. The line says where the team went, what they did, what they loaded, and where they slept. They load stone at Tura. They sail. They arrive at the harbor of Khufu. They unload. They return. They do it again. Some entries record a round trip completed in a couple of days. Others record time spent on other duties, or waiting, or moving between sites. There are entries where the crew is doing something else entirely, because a work gang that exists is a resource the state will use for whatever it needs that week. And there are supply records alongside the logbook. Grain issued, bread and beer distributed, textiles handed out, accounts of what the team received in return for the work. It is, in the most literal sense, a payroll. Now hold that against the story we started with. Herodotus said 100,000 men, driven under compulsion in 3-month shifts, hating the king so much they would not speak his name. Mirror says 40 men in a named team, working a boat, being issued bread and beer and cloth, with their days written down in a ledger by an inspector who reported to someone and who expected the ledger to be checked. One of those accounts was written 2,000 years after the fact by a foreigner. The other was written at the time by a man doing the work. There is something else in the logbook, and it is the detail that makes historians go quiet. Mirror refers to his superior, the official ultimately directing the operation. The name given is Onkhef, and he is described with a title indicating he was a king's brother and held the highest civil office in the land. We know who that is. There's a bust of Onkhef found at Giza, now in Boston, and it is one of the most extraordinary pieces of sculpture to survive from the ancient world, because it is not idealized. It shows a middle-aged man with a slightly heavy face, lines around the mouth, a receding hairline, an expression that is faintly tired. It looks like a portrait of somebody who has been managing a large project for a long time. So the chain is complete. We have the man on the boat, and we have the face of the man he answered to. And we have the harbor where the paperwork was stored, and we have the town where the workers slept, and the cemetery where they were buried. The Great Pyramid is not an unexplained object. It is one of the best documented construction projects of the ancient world, and the documentation is only unfamiliar because for most of history, nobody had it. One more thing about Meyer, and then we'll move on. His logbook records the transport of casing stone. That casing was the last stage of the work, the smooth white limestone skin that went on the outside once the core was up, which means Mirror was writing near the end of the project, in Khufu's 27th year. He was there for the finish. He watched it being closed in. And when he wrote his last entry and sealed his papers in a store at a harbor on the Red Sea, he had no idea whatsoever that 4,500 years later, those pages would be the closest thing we have to standing on the plateau and watching it happen. So let's go there. Let's take an ordinary day, sometime in the middle of the project, and walk through it slowly. It begins before the light. The town wakes early because the work is done in the cool part of the day, and because in a place organized around a river and a sun that both keep their own schedule, nobody has any reason to argue with dawn. The sky over the delta side is beginning to gray. The pyramid is a black shape against it, unfinished, its upper courses still stepped and rough, scaffolding and ramps running up the sides like the scars of something half-healed. The first sound in the town is not voices, it is grinding. Somewhere in the bakery quarter, women are already at the querns, pushing stone over stone, working emmer wheat into flour. It is slow, heavy, repetitive work, and the skeletal evidence from Egyptian sites is unambiguous about what it did to the people who spent their lives doing it. Worn knees, damaged toes, arthritis in the wrists and shoulders. The archaeology of ancient bread is written into women's joints across the entire ancient world. The fires are lit next. The heavy conical molds go into the ash to heat, and the dough goes in after. And the smell of that dense, dark bread starts moving through the streets before most people are upright. In the breweries beside them, yesterday's mash is being worked. Bread and beer were made from the same grain in overlapping processes, which is why the two buildings sit together. Someone is straining, someone is pouring, someone is checking the vats set into the floor. By the time the sky is properly light, thousands of people are eating. Then the gangs form up. Not a crowd streaming out of a gate. Teams. 20 men who know each other, gathering under a name, joining a watch, joining a gang. Somebody is counting heads. Somebody is noting who is absent and why. Because we know they wrote that down. And then they walk out to the work. And the work splits in every direction at once. Down at the quarry face, south of the pyramid, men are cutting into the bedrock with copper chisels and wooden mallets. The limestone here is soft enough to work and hard enough to hold, and the technique is patient rather than violent. Channels cut around a block, wedges driven along the base, the stone persuaded loose rather than broken free. You can still see the negative shapes in the rock today, where blocks were lifted out. The plateau south of the pyramid looks like a place where something enormous has been quarried away, because that is exactly what it is. At the copper workshops, smiths are reworking tools that went blunt yesterday. This never stops. Copper is soft, limestone is abrasive, and every chisel on that site needs attention constantly. The metal workers are as essential as the masons, and nobody outside the trade ever thinks about them. On the transport routes, the sledges are moving, teams hauling on ropes, the load lashed down, and a man walking ahead, pouring water onto the sand in front of the runners, doing the thing that was painted on a tomb wall and misread as ritual for 2,000 years. At the harbor, boats are coming in. Fine white limestone from Tura on the far bank. Somewhere in that traffic, in Khufu's 27th year, is a man named Merer, tying up his boat and getting ready to write the day down. And on the structure itself, high up, the setting crews are working. This is the precise end of the operation. Blocks arriving, being levered into position, checked, adjusted, seated. Surveyors keeping the courses level and the corners true. using water channels, plumb lines, and set squares, and doing it well enough that 4,500 years later, we measure their work and find it accurate to a matter of centimeters. The noise across the whole plateau must have been extraordinary. Stone on stone, mallets, ropes under load, thousands of voices, hauling teams working to a rhythm, because that is the only way a large group pulls together. And a rhythm needs a call, and a call needs a voice. Somebody on every one of those days was singing to keep the pull in time. And underneath all of it, running quietly, is the administration. Somebody is counting the cattle that arrived this morning. Somebody is logging grain out of the stores. Somebody is recording which gang delivered how many blocks. Somebody is writing down that a man in the 4th team has a broken arm and will not be working, and arranging for him to be fed anyway. That last one is the part that never appears in the films, and it is the part that made the whole thing possible. The heat builds through the middle of the day. Work slows. There is a break. Food, shade, water. And then the light gets long and gold across the plateau, and the shadows of the ramps stretch out, and the day starts to close. They walk back down into the town in the dark, in their teams, past the bakeries where tomorrow's bread is already being started. Because they were there, that is the first thing to say, and it is the thing the films never show. Every image most people carry of pyramid building is exclusively male. Ranks of men on ropes, men on scaffolding, men under the whip. And the effect of that image, repeated for a century, is that half the population of that town simply disappears from the story. The cemeteries put them back. Women were buried at Giza, in both cemeteries, in numbers that make it clear they were not visitors. Some of them are buried alongside husbands, with their own names recorded, and in some cases, their own titles. Children were buried there too, including infants, which tells you something plain and slightly heartbreaking. Families lived on that plateau. People were born there. People died there very young, as they did everywhere in the ancient world. This was not a barracks. It was a town, with everything a town contains. And when you start asking what those women were doing, the answer turns out to be most of the work that kept the site alive. The bakeries and the breweries almost certainly ran on women's labor, because in Egyptian households, they generally did, and the skeletal evidence supports it. The grinding injuries turn up in female skeletons across Egypt with grim consistency. Emmer wheat had to be pounded and ground by hand into flour, and for a population of thousands eating bread as a staple, that is an enormous, unrelenting daily task. Somebody had to spin and weave the linen. Somebody had to make and repair the ropes, and a site like that consumed rope constantly. Somebody had to make pottery, and the excavations turn up ceramics in quantities that imply local production. Somebody had to process the fish. Somebody had to carry water. The pyramid was not built by the men hauling stone. It was built by everyone who kept those men fed, clothed, hydrated, and shod. And a large share of that was done by women whose names, for the most part, we do not have. Some we do. There are titles that appear on Old Kingdom monuments belonging to women. Priestesses of Hathor, most commonly, which was a real office with real income attached. Overseers of weavers, women who managed household estates. Egyptian women could own property, could inherit, could go to court and testify, could initiate divorce and take their property with them when they did. Compared to almost every other ancient society, and to a fair number of much later ones, that is a striking degree of legal standing. It would be wrong to romanticize it. This was still a rigidly hierarchical society, and the great majority of women worked extremely hard for very little. But they were people with legal existence, not property, and the record is clear on that point. Then there are the children. They were there, and past a certain age, they were working, because there was no version of the ancient world in which they were not. Fetching, carrying, helping in the bakeries, learning a trade from a father or an uncle, in the way a mason's son learns to hold a chisel by holding one. And a few of them were learning to write. That deserves a moment, because literacy in Old Kingdom Egypt was rare. The estimates are low, somewhere in the low single digits as a share of the population. But an operation like this one could not run without scribes, and a site with a permanent population would have had boys being trained into that work, because the state always needed more of them. Somewhere in that town, in the evening, a child was being taught to draw hieroglyphs on a shard of pottery by somebody who needed him to be good at it within a few years. And there is one more group who lived on that plateau and who deserve to be named, because the argument this whole video is built around can slide too easily into a claim that nobody wants to make. Egypt did have unfree people. There were prisoners taken in campaigns to the south and the east. There were people bound into service through debt or through birth into a dependent household. Egyptian has words for these categories, and Egyptologists argue about the precise weight of each of them, because none of them map cleanly onto the modern word slave. So the honest position is not that ancient Egypt had no unfree labor. It is narrower and better supported than that. It is that the specific project of building the Great Pyramid, on the evidence recovered from the ground at Giza, was carried out by an organized, fed, housed, medically treated, named and buried workforce, and that the popular image, a nation in chains, dying in the sand under a whip, building a monument they hated for a king they despised, is not supported by anything found at the site. What the site shows is a town with bakeries and breweries, and a hospital and streets, and men who named their crews after drinking. and women grinding grain until their joints failed, and children learning to write, and families burying each other in the sand within sight of the thing they were making. Everything at Giza has to be read from objects: bones, bread molds, cattle remains, a name carved above a grave. It is powerful evidence, but it is silent. We are inferring what those lives were like from what they left behind, and inference has limits. For the workers' own voices, we have to go forward roughly 1,000 years and about 700 kilometers south to a village in the hills behind the Valley of the Kings. The site is called Deir el-Medina. It was purpose-built by the state to house the craftsmen who cut and decorated the royal tombs. Not pyramid builders. By this period, kings were being buried in rock-cut tombs in a hidden valley, but the direct professional descendants of the men at Giza, skilled workers employed by the crown, housed in a settlement laid out by the government, working on the most important construction project in the country. And this village was literate. Not universally, but far beyond the Egyptian average, because these men were draftsmen and scribes and painters who worked with text all day. They could write, they wrote constantly, and they wrote on the cheapest available material, flakes of limestone and broken pottery called ostraca, which they used the way we use scrap paper. Then they threw them away into a pit, into the desert, into the rubbish. And in that climate, rubbish does not rot. Tens of thousands of these fragments have been recovered. Letters, legal disputes, shopping lists, laundry accounts, love poems, complaints about neighbors, drawings, including some frankly filthy ones, records of who borrowed a donkey and never brought it back. It is, without exaggeration, the most intimate window we have into ordinary ancient life anywhere in the world. And among all of it, there is a document that changes how you read the entire history of labor. There is an attendance register, a foreman's record of who turned up to work, and when they did not, why. The reasons are written down day by day, and they are extraordinarily ordinary. Ill, suffering with his eyes, brewing beer, making offerings to his God, building his house. His mother is unwell. His daughter is unwell. His wife is giving birth. Attending a funeral. Bitten by a scorpion. And on more than one occasion, a man is recorded as absent because he had been drinking. Now, think about what an attendance register with excuses actually implies. It implies you are expected to turn up. It implies that if you do not, there is a reason, and the reason is recorded rather than punished automatically. It implies a foreman who accepts that a man whose wife is in labor is not coming in today. It implies sick leave. It implies that the state understood these workers as people with lives, households, illnesses, religious duties, and hangovers. That is not a record kept about property. Nobody writes down that a slave stayed home because his daughter was ill. And then there is the strike. In the 29th year of the reign of Ramesses III, the rations that paid the workers of Deir el-Medina stopped arriving on time. The grain was late. Egypt in this period was under real economic strain, and the supply system that fed the village was failing. They waited. Then they waited longer. And then they walked off the job. The workmen left the village, marched to the mortuary temples, and sat down. They occupied the temple precincts and refused to move. Their complaint was recorded in their own words by one of their own scribes. And what it says is not political. It is desperate and practical. They said they were hungry. They said they had no bread, no fish, no vegetables, no ointment. They said they had come here because of hunger and because of thirst. The authorities negotiated. Rations were found. The men went back. And then, when payment slipped again, they did it a second time. This is the earliest recorded labor strike in human history, written down by the people who carried it out roughly 3,000 years ago. You cannot strike if you are property. The concept does not apply. A strike is the withdrawal of labor, which is only possible if the labor was in some meaningful sense yours to withdraw. And if there is somebody on the other side who needs it and can be pressured by its absence. These men understood that they had an agreement with the state: work in exchange for rations. And when the state broke its half, they stopped working and said so out loud, in writing, and expected to be listened to. They were listened to. Now, Deir el-Medina is 1,000 years after Giza, and it would be sloppy to simply project it backwards. Egypt changed enormously over that millennium. These were elite craftsmen, better paid and better housed than most. But it does tell us something the silent evidence at Giza cannot. It tells us that the relationship between the Egyptian state and its skilled workforce was, at least by this period, understood on both sides as an exchange, with obligations running in both directions. Rations for labor, and a workforce that considered itself entitled to complain. There is one more thing to deal with before we let this rest, and it is the strangest part of the whole story. Because after everything, the town, the bakeries, the bones, the graves, the logbook, the names painted in the dark, a very large number of people still do not believe it. Not that the workers were free, that the workers existed at all. There is an entire industry built on the claim that the pyramids could not have been made by ancient Egyptians, that the stones are too heavy, the angles too precise, the astronomy too accurate, that someone else must have done it, a lost civilization, survivors of a vanished continent, visitors from somewhere else. It is worth asking, gently, why that idea is so appealing. Part of it is the genuine gap in the record. We do not know exactly how the stone was raised, and gaps invite filling. That is a normal human response to an unanswered question. But part of it is something else, and it is less comfortable to look at. The claim has a history. It grew up in the 19th and early 20th centuries in a Europe that was busy occupying the countries whose monuments it was measuring. And a great deal of early speculation about who really built the pyramids emerged from a worldview that could not accommodate Africans having done it. The specific mythologies have changed. The underlying shape of the argument, that the people who lived there were not capable of the thing they demonstrably made, has been remarkably persistent. Notice that it is applied selectively. Nobody insists that the Parthenon required outside assistance. Nobody proposes that the Romans had help with the Pantheon. The doubt attaches to some civilizations and not others, and the pattern of which is not random. Zahi Hawass, who has spent his life on that plateau, has been blunt about it for decades. No extraterrestrial beings, no supernatural forces. Egyptians built the pyramids. And the evidence he can point to is not a theory, it is a town. You do not need to speculate about who built the Great Pyramid, because we found where they slept. We found what they ate. We found the ovens their bread was baked in, and the vats their beer was brewed in, and the room where their broken arms were set. We found their graves, and their names, and their job titles, and the crew names they painted on the inside of the stones. Every alternative theory has to explain away all of it. It has to explain a purpose-built settlement of thousands of ordinary Egyptian workers, positioned exactly where you would put them, eating exactly what a state would feed them, buried exactly where they fell, with the tools of their trade beside them. Nobody has ever managed that. They mostly do not try. They talk about the stones and never about the bakeries, because the bakeries are boring. And boring is what the truth usually looks like. There is a real loss in this, and it is not academic. Those men and women worked for 20 years on the largest thing anyone had ever built. They wore out their spines carrying it. They ground their knees to nothing, making the bread that fed it. They buried their children in the sand beside it. They signed their crew names in a sealed chamber in the dark because they were proud of what they had done and wanted some record to exist, even if no one ever read it. And 4,500 years later, the most common response is to say it must have been somebody else. They deserve better than that. So here is where we leave it. In 1990, on an ordinary afternoon, a horse put its foot through the top of a wall that nobody knew was there. And underneath that wall, still exactly where they had been left, were the people the story had been about all along. Not 100,000 nameless figures under a whip. A town. Streets and bakeries and breweries, and a room where the injured were treated and let heal. Families. Names carved over graves so that they might continue. Overseer of the side of the pyramid. Director of workers. Inspector of the craftsmen. Friend of Khufu. And somewhere deep inside that enormous, silent structure, in a cramped space above the burial chamber that was sealed shut when the work was finished and never meant to be opened again, a crew of men who had spent their lives moving stone wrote their team name on the rock in red ochre, in the dark, where no one would ever see it. The drunkards of Menkaure. The friends of Khufu. They sealed it up and they walked home, and the sand came in over the town, and the desert kept it for 4,500 years. And then a horse stumbled. And somewhere else out there tonight, under another quiet stretch of ground that nobody has thought to dig, there are almost certainly more of them. More ovens, more graves, more names, written by people who assumed no one was ever going to look. They are still waiting, suffering with his eyes, brewing beer, making offerings to his God, building his house. His mother is unwell. His daughter is unwell. His wife is giving birth, attending a funeral, bitten by a scorpion. And on more than one occasion, a man is recorded as absent because he had been drinking. Now, think about what an attendance register with excuses actually implies. It implies you are expected to turn up. It implies that if you do not, there is a reason, and the reason is recorded rather than punished automatically. It implies a foreman who accepts that a man whose wife is in labor is not coming in today. It implies sick leave. It implies that the state understood these workers as people with lives, households, illnesses, religious duties, and hangovers. That is not a record kept about property. Nobody writes down that a slave stayed home because his daughter was ill. And then there is the strike. In the 29th year of the reign of Ramesses III, the rations that paid the workers of Deir el-Medina stopped arriving on time. The grain was late. Egypt in this period was under real economic strain, and the supply system that fed the village was failing. They waited. Then they waited longer, And then they walked off the job. The workmen left the village, marched to the mortuary temples, and sat down. They occupied the temple precincts and refused to move. Their complaint was recorded in their own words by one of their own scribes. And what it says is not political. It is desperate and practical. They said they were hungry. They said they had no bread, no fish, no vegetables, no ointment. They said they had come here because of hunger and because of thirst. The authorities negotiated. Rations were found. The men went back. And then, when payment slipped again, they did it a second time. This is the earliest recorded labor strike in human history, written down by the people who carried it out roughly 3,000 years ago. You cannot strike if you are property. The concept does not apply. A strike is the withdrawal of labor, which is only possible if the labor was in some meaningful sense yours to withdraw. And if there is somebody on the other side who needs it and can be pressured by its absence. These men understood that they had an agreement with the state, work in exchange for rations. And when the state broke its half, they stopped working and said so out loud, in writing, and expected to be listened to. They were listened to. Now, Deir el-Medina is 1,000 years after Giza, and it would be sloppy to simply project it backwards. Egypt changed enormously over that millennium. These were elite craftsmen, better paid and better housed than most. But it does tell us something the silent evidence at Giza cannot. It tells us that the relationship between the Egyptian state and its skilled workforce was, at least by this period, understood on both sides as an exchange, with obligations running in both directions. Rations for labor, and a workforce that considered itself entitled to complain. There is one more thing to deal with before we let this rest, and it is the strangest part of the whole story. Because after everything, the town, the bakeries, the bones, the graves, the logbook, the names painted in the dark, a very large number of people still do not believe it. Not that the workers were free, that the workers existed at all. There is an entire industry built on the claim that the pyramids could not have been made by ancient Egyptians, that the stones are too heavy, the angles too precise, the astronomy too accurate, that someone else must have done it, a lost civilization, survivors of a vanished continent, visitors from somewhere else. It is worth asking, gently, why that idea is so appealing. Part of it is the genuine gap in the record. We do not know exactly how the stone was raised, and gaps invite filling. That is a normal human response to an unanswered question. But part of it is something else, and it is less comfortable to look at. The claim has a history. It grew up in the 19th and early 20th centuries in a Europe that was busy occupying the countries whose monuments it was measuring. And a great deal of early speculation about who really built the pyramids emerged from a worldview that could not accommodate Africans having done it. The specific mythologies have changed. The underlying shape of the argument, that the people who lived there were not capable of the thing they demonstrably made, has been remarkably persistent. Notice that it is applied selectively. Nobody insists that the Parthenon required outside assistance. Nobody proposes that the Romans had help with the Pantheon. The doubt attaches to some civilizations and not others, and the pattern of which is not random. Zahi Hawass, who has spent his life on that plateau, has been blunt about it for decades. No extraterrestrial beings, no supernatural forces. Egyptians built the pyramids. And the evidence he can point to is not a theory, it is a town. You do not need to speculate about who built the Great Pyramid, because we found where they slept. We found what they ate. We found the ovens their bread was baked in, and the vats their beer was brewed in, and the room where their broken arms were set. We found their graves, and their names, and their job titles, and the crew names they painted on the inside of the stones. Every alternative theory has to explain away all of it. It has to explain a purpose-built settlement of thousands of ordinary Egyptian workers, positioned exactly where you would put them, eating exactly what a state would feed them, buried exactly where they fell, with the tools of their trade beside them. Nobody has ever managed that. They mostly do not try. They talk about the stones and never about the bakeries, because the bakeries are boring. And boring is what the truth usually looks like. There is a real loss in this, and it is not academic. Those men and women worked for 20 years on the largest thing anyone had ever built. They wore out their spines carrying it. They ground their knees to nothing, making the bread that fed it. They buried their children in the sand beside it. They signed their crew names in a sealed chamber in the dark because they were proud of what they had done and wanted some record to exist, even if no one ever read it. And 4,500 years later, the most common response is to say it must have been somebody else. They deserve better than that. So here is where we leave it. In 1990, on an ordinary afternoon, a horse put its foot through the top of a wall that nobody knew was there. And underneath that wall, still exactly where they had been left, were the people the story had been about all along. Not 100,000 nameless figures under a whip. A town. Streets and bakeries and breweries, and a room where the injured were treated and let heal. Families. Names carved over graves so that they might continue. Overseer, of the side of the pyramid, director of workers, inspector of the craftsmen, friend of Khufu, and somewhere deep inside that enormous, silent structure, in a cramped space above the burial chamber that was sealed shut when the work was finished and never meant to be opened again, a crew of men who had spent their lives moving stone wrote their team name on the rock in red ochre, in the dark, where no one would ever see it. The drunkards of Menkaure, the friends of Khufu. They sealed it up and they walked home, and the sand came in over the town, and the desert kept it for 4,500 years. And then a horse stumbled. And somewhere else out there tonight, under another quiet stretch of ground that nobody has thought to dig, there are almost certainly more of them. More ovens, more graves, more names, written by people who assumed no one was ever going to look. They are still waiting. Humans had help with the pantheon. The doubt attaches to some civilizations and not others, and the pattern of which is not random. Zahi Hawass, who has spent his life on that plateau, has been blunt about it for decades. No extraterrestrial beings, no supernatural forces. Egyptians built the pyramids. And the evidence he can point to is not a theory, it is a town. You do not need to speculate about who built the Great Pyramid, because we found where they slept. We found what they ate. We found the ovens their bread was baked in, and the vats their beer was brewed in, and the room where their broken arms were set. We found their graves, and their names, and their job titles, and the crew names they painted on the inside of the stones. Every alternative theory has to explain away all of it. It has to explain a purpose-built settlement of thousands of ordinary Egyptian workers, positioned exactly where you would put them, eating exactly what a state would feed them, buried exactly where they fell, with the tools of their trade beside them. Nobody has ever managed that. They mostly do not try. They talk about the stones and never about the bakeries, because the bakeries are boring. And boring is what the truth usually looks like. There is a real loss in this, and it is not academic. Those men and women worked for 20 years on the largest thing anyone had ever built. They wore out their spines carrying it. They ground their knees to nothing, making the bread that fed it. They buried their children in the sand beside it. They signed their crew names in a sealed chamber in the dark because they were proud of what they had done and wanted some record to exist, even if no one ever read it. And 4,500 years later, the most common response is to say it must have been somebody else. They deserve better than that. So here is where we leave it. In 1990, on an ordinary afternoon, a horse put its foot through the top of a wall that nobody knew was there. And underneath that wall Still, exactly where they had been left were the people the story had been about all along. Not 100,000 nameless figures under a whip. A town. Streets and bakeries and breweries, and a room where the injured were treated and let heal. Families. Names carved over graves so that they might continue. Overseer of the side of the pyramid. Director of workers. Inspector of the craftsmen. Friend of Khufu. And somewhere deep inside that enormous, silent structure, in a cramped space above the burial chamber that was sealed shut when the work was finished and never meant to be opened again, a crew of men who had spent their lives moving stone wrote their team name on the rock in red ochre, in the dark, where no one would ever see it. The drunkards of Menkaure. The friends of Khufu. They sealed it up and they walked home, and the sand came in over the town, and the desert kept it for 4,500 years. And then a horse stumbled. And somewhere else out there tonight, under another quiet stretch of ground that nobody has thought to dig, there are almost certainly more of them. More ovens, more graves, more names, written by people who assumed no one was ever going to look. They are still waiting